So the presentation will provide perspective on applications for high-risk sites. We have 4 learning objectives for this talk. First, we'll start off sort of repeating the definition of high-risk sites. Second, we'll discuss management of high-risk sites, potential remediation technologies, and how to reclassify high-risk sites after successful completion of remediation. Finally, we'll go over a few examples to demonstrate some of the high-risk site concepts. Next slide, please. So in this first learning objective, we will discuss risk and what defines a high-risk site. We'll touch briefly again on site risk classification, and finally, administer a mandate to oversee high-risk site remediation. Let's get started. Next slide, please. So first, we're starting by looking at the difference between risk and high risk. For contaminated sites, risk is the chance of harmful effects to human health or ecological systems, resulting from exposure to contaminants introduced into the environment. For a contaminated site to pose risk, 3 things need to be present. First, there need to be an exceedance of 1 or more of the numerical standards listed in the Schedule 3 of the Contaminated Sites Regulation, the CSR, in either soil, groundwater, vapor, and/or in sediment. Second, there needs to be a receptor present on the site. This could, for example, be humans, soil invertebrates, or aquatic life. And finally, there needs to be an exposure pathway between the media and the receptor. For example, humans in direct contact with contaminated soil, or contaminated groundwater draining into an aquatic receiving bin. Next. So as described in Peter's previous talk, number 18, a contaminated site is considered to be high risk if one of the following 2 conditions are present. First, if the concentrations in either soil, groundwater, vapor, or sediment exceed the upper cap concentrations as defined in Protocol 11 and are typically 10 times higher than the CSR Schedule 3 standards, and there is a complete exposure pathway between the receptor and the media, the site is considered to be high risk. Also, if there's mobile non-aqueous phase liquids, the NAPLs, as defined in Protocol 16 on your site, this site will be considered high risk. Next slide, please. So the site risk classification process is outlined in Protocol 12. The presence of NAPL or contaminant concentration that exceed upper cap concentration does not necessarily mean that the site is high risk. In order to be classified as high risk, the NAPL must be considered mobile and migrating, as per Protocol 16, or there is an upper cap concentration exceedance with a complete exposure pathway as defined in Protocol 12 using the exposure pathway questionnaire. Finally, as we heard, a site is officially classified as high risk if remediation of the high risk conditions cannot be completed within 90 days. And if the high risk conditions can't be remediated within the 90 days, the site risk classification is considered pending. Next slide, please. So the ministry is mandated by legislation to provide direct oversight of the remediation of high-risk sites. It is important to understand and remember that sites with high-risk conditions require high standards of care, of investigation, and remediation. The degree of minister involvement can be variable, as every high-risk site poses its own challenges. And when required, the director may order a high-risk site to be investigated or remediated by the responsible person as defined in EMA. Those ordered sites involve the highest degree of minister involvement and oversight. So currently, nearly 200 contaminated sites in the province are classified as high risk. On the pie chart here on the right, it demonstrates the breakdown of high-risk sites by the types of industries. As you can see, dry cleaners represents the biggest group of sites that are considered high risk, followed by contaminated sites within the petroleum industry, could for example be gas stations. Next slide, please. On to our second learning objective, where we'll cover what happens when a site is classified as high risk. It is a staged process. At the beginning, a remediation plan and schedule are provided to the ministry for review and approval. Then remediation activities occur at the site in accordance with the approved plan and schedule, with regular monitoring and reporting to the ministry on remediation progress and site conditions. And the final step is completion of remediation. Next slide, please. When a site has been designated as high risk and the high risk conditions cannot be removed within 90 days, a letter from the director with requirements is issued to the responsible person indicating that they must submit a remediation plan and schedule. Ensure to provide detailed rationale based on the remediation and investigations conducted to date. This requirement must be complied within a stipulated amount of time, usually 1 to 3 months. The submitted documents are then reviewed by the ministry team, and the statutory decision maker approves a remediation plan and schedule if they're considered acceptable, and then imposes reporting requirements. Remediation plans and schedules should be detailed, clear, and accurate, and the schedule should have sufficient data to inform the ministry of the upcoming remediation activities. Next slide, please. So the person responsible for contaminating the site completes the remediation of high-risk conditions as per the approved remediation plan and schedule. Remediation can involve a number of different remediation technologies, which typically will be characterized by either recovery, control, destruction, or risk assessment of the contaminants. For recovery, the most commonly used method is excavation. Could also include extraction, like pump and treat of groundwater, and/or separation of contaminants. Control of contaminants will often include immobilization. This could, for example, be encapsulation. Destruction of contaminants is often some sort of bioremediation. It could, for example, be monitored natural attenuation. And finally, risk assessment can be performed, which often will utilize controlling open pathways, for example, by placing a permanent cap on contaminated soil to make sure that no person or animal can come in contact with the soil. Next slide, please. Monitoring and reporting are very important components, helping the ministry to ensure that remediation is progressing as planned at a high-risk contaminated site. Remediation of high-risk conditions commonly takes an extended period of time, and responsible persons are typically required to submit progress reports on a regular basis. The frequency of reporting varies depending on the site, ranging from quarterly to biannually. The progress report should include a clear description of remediation activities taking place since the last reporting period, including performance of any treatment systems on the site. Reporting is generally tied to the media and substances which resulted in the high-risk conditions. But note that in certain circumstances, if you're using risk assessment, you may have to report on all risks that have been identified. The reports must include comprehensive and accurate data so that the ministry team can evaluate progress effectively. Trend analyses for contamination in groundwater and soil vapor, if it's applicable, and description of any equipment failures, deviations, and/or corrections should also be included in the reports. Finally, progress reports must be submitted on time to avoid any non-compliance. Next slide, please. So once remediation is complete, the responsible person submits a completion of remediation report for remediation of the high-risk conditions. This report will then be reviewed by the ministry team, and a statutory decision maker will decide whether the site can be classified to either a non-high-risk site or a risk-managed high-risk site. And now I'll pass it on to Evan, who will talk more about this site reclassification. Next slide, please.
Thank you, Annette. In this section of the presentation, I will discuss the types of site reclassification and provide an explanation of their differences. I will also discuss how to submit an application for a site reclassification and some of the things to remember when submitting to ensure that the application is not rejected and won't trigger additional requests for information from the ministry. Next slide, please. Sites can be reclassified from a high risk to a non-high risk or risk-managed high-risk site. Please note that a reclassified site can still be contaminated. If the concentrations of contaminants are determined to be below the upper cap concentrations provided in Protocol 11, then the site can be reclassified to non-high risk. A site can also be reclassified to a risk-managed high-risk site, which is still considered high risk, but is being managed in a way so that exposure pathways to receptors are reduced or eliminated. It should be noted that for some sites, risk-managed high risk is likely the only viable option, as contamination can be complex and/or underneath structures such as roadways. It should be well understood that sites classified as risk-managed high risk need to be treated more cautiously, as they require ongoing monitoring to ensure risk management measures remain functional. Additionally, sites that are reclassified to non-high risk can obtain certification by a recommendation of an approved professional, whereas risk-managed high-risk sites must be reviewed for certification by the ministry unless a pre-approval is obtained. There are more reporting requirements imposed on risk-managed high-risk sites to ensure proper risk controls, performance, and monitoring. Next slide, please. You may recognize this slide if you attended the previous talk. However, it's important to show this again. Review of reclassification of a high-risk site is a time-consuming process with many details to consider by the ministry. Reports that are missing information are usually sent back with a request for more information, with the result being increased review and approval times. Thus, it is important to have submitted all of the reporting requirements listed on this slide to ensure a complete, detailed, and accurate application. Make sure that the reports have approved professional sign-off, as required by the protocols or stipulated in the Environmental Management Act and Contaminated Sites Regulation. In the next slide, I will discuss a few things to remember that can help to prepare a more effective application. Next slide, please. Here are some things to remember and consider when applying for reclassification of a site. Next. As mentioned before, reports should be tailored to address the high-risk conditions only. For example, the site can still be contaminated. Do not confuse a non-high-risk site with a risk-managed high-risk site. Next. A screening level risk assessment cannot be used to reclassify a site. A detailed risk assessment is required. If a detailed risk assessment will be used to reclassify the site, it is always good to double check with the statutory decision maker to see if the risk assessment should include all potential risks. When completing a detailed risk assessment to reclassify a site, please follow Protocol 1. Risk assessments must be thorough, especially for high-risk sites. A fee for the risk assessment report review will apply. Next. Include all of the data in the reports. And finally, include seasonal sampling to demonstrate plume stability. Lavinia will now present some examples of high-risk sites. Next slide, please.
Thank you, Evan. Responsible persons are required to remediate high-risk conditions at their site. Successful remediation strategies can remove or decrease contamination at these sites. This portion of the presentation will provide examples of typical high-risk sites and how they are commonly remediated in order to be eligible for site reclassification. High-risk sites usually fall into these scenarios. Sites with mobile NAPL, as per requirements set out in Protocol 12 and 16, soil contaminated with typically metals exceeding upper cap concentrations in the top 1 meter subsurface, indoor soil vapor exceeding upper cap concentrations, groundwater exceeding upper cap concentrations near an aquatic receiving environment, and finally, sediment exceeding upper cap concentrations in rivers or foreshore areas. Next slide, please. Under the definitions in Protocol 16, it can be determined that a site has mobile LNAPL or DNAPL. We commonly see sites that get classified as high risk because either LNAPL is present in an area greater than 50 meters squared or DNAPL is present. And NAPL in the wells are observed to have variable or increasing thicknesses. There are a handful of cases where NAPL has been observed in fractured bedrock, which is automatically considered mobile. Mobile NAPL sources have the potential to migrate, resulting in the NAPL body spreading or expanding laterally and vertically, and creating large groundwater contamination plumes. Generally, responsible persons can become eligible to obtain site reclassification to a non-high-risk site by demonstrating that NAPL conditions in the subsurface are stable and not migrating. This can be achieved by using a combination of NAPL remediation technologies. For example, employing a multi-phase extraction and treatment system for shallow NAPL, and then demonstrating through quarterly monitoring events that NAPL thicknesses remain stable for at least 1 year. Other lines of evidence, such as historical concentrations in groundwater, can also be used to help demonstrate NAPL stability in the subsurface. Next slide, please. Another typical high-risk site that occurs is contamination in soil used as shallow fill material. This fill material is usually contaminated with metals in concentrations exceeding upper cap concentrations. Examples include the False Creek area of Vancouver, where there is active development in a historically industrial area and is filled with poor quality fill material. In these situations, high-risk conditions are generally removed by excavation. Sometimes excavation is combined with placing the remaining contaminated soil under a cap, such as walkways or parking lots, or under the new building that's being built. Remediation is typically completed during site redevelopment for these examples. Most of these high-risk sites are eventually remediated to the applicable contaminated sites regulation standards. Next slide, please. Vapor intrusion into a building is a common example of a high-risk site that can become eligible for reclassification to a risk-managed high-risk site. Commonly, the vapor mitigation system is built as part of or relies on the ventilation or HVAC system of the building to remove high-risk conditions. Many of these sites are remediated to the contaminated sites regulation standards so that a certification document can be obtained, typically a certificate of compliance. The certificate will include a risk condition related to the vapor management system. In some cases, risk management other than an HVAC system may be in place. For example, a thick foundation combined with a vapor barrier can be installed to impede vapor ingression into a building, or a passive vapor mitigation system may be installed. Please note that a performance verification plan, or a PVP, is required in these instances because there will be ongoing maintenance and monitoring to demonstrate that the risk controls remain operational. Annual statements or reports may also need to be submitted for ministry review. Next slide, please. In this instance, a contaminated site is situated by an aquatic receiving environment, for example, the Fraser River. Concentrations of contaminants of concern in groundwater are observed to exceed upper cap concentrations within 10 meters of the high water mark. A remediation plan and schedule should include detailed methodologies and design to remove the high-risk conditions. Generally, remediation includes the removal of upland source material, for example, in situ treatments such as chemical injection, or ex situ treatments such as excavation and disposal. Removal of the source material is combined with seasonal monitoring over time, which could take years, to determine groundwater plume stability. Detailed risk assessment may be needed to demonstrate risks to the environment are acceptable to the director. Next slide, please. We have encountered some sites where sediments in the foreshore area or riverbank exceed upper cap concentrations in an area greater than 50 meters squared. High risk conditions can be physically removed if access is easy, but are often only partially removed and then capped with infrastructure, such as building a commercial wharf supported by sheet pile wall or grout curtain. A geotextile liner or clean soil can also be placed on top of contaminated sediments and secured with riprap. The type of remediation technology is dependent on site circumstances, such as whether sediment is located in a depositional or scouring environment. Capping in the intertidal zone can be difficult to maintain due to the damage an engineer cap can receive from the action of waves and climate change impacts. The majority of these sites have a detailed risk assessment completed in combination with excavation or capping of the high-risk sediments. The detailed risk assessment will often need to evaluate all risks, including those defined as high risk, to provide assurance to the statutory decision maker that there is little risk to aquatic life in the surface water and the biologically active zone from both sediment and pore water contamination. Next, please. Thank you. I just wanted to indicate that we do have resources that can be found on our website if you need more information. Just to conclude this presentation, there were 4 learning objectives discussed today: defining risk and high risk, the process involved in the management of a high-risk site and the potential remediation technologies, reclassification of high-risk sites after successful completion of remediation, and finally, we presented a few examples to demonstrate some of the concepts discussed. Thank you for listening to our presentation today.